think we're ready now. We have a panel here of representatives from each of the 4 nations in the United Kingdom and Ireland, and we're going to take them in pairs, and they're going to reflect on the current situation from the perspective of their own country. Can we start with Aled from Wales? Aled will speak for 5 minutes, and then Richard from Scotland will speak, and then we'll have a bit of discussion, and then we'll go back and take the other 2 countries and do it that way. So we're pairing them up to begin with. So Aled, okay. Aled is the Chief Executive of the team?
Yes. Ooh, can you hear me okay? Yes. Yes, a bit of an echo sound, okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm here with a number of Welsh colleagues. Gethin over there is my colleague in Cytun, he's our policy officer. He knows more about this issue than I do, as does Carol Wardman in the background there as well from the Church in Wales, and my good colleague Chris Gillam. Just to give you, rather than a detailed response, just 2 narratives that might be useful for you at this point. Last year in Wales we had a very sacred moment. It was the passing of 50 years since the Aberfan disaster. And on the morning when we were asked to do the commemoration, I decided that I would stay outside my own house in the village of KENNETH for a very good reason. When I got to my front door, there's a coal tip, which in 1939 slid into the valley. It almost removed the waters of the Taff, but miraculously nobody was injured or hurt. And out of that experience was a thing called the Powell Memo, which taught us what we should do with tips and water. And the warnings were ignored for Aberfan. And that's why the disaster happened. Aberfan is just 6 miles from my home. It is very much a community, as I think Billy Shepherd once called, a community of the left behind. The churches were very busy in that disaster, opening chapels up for morgues, ministers pastoring and staying there for the rest of their lives. And this is part of our legacy in Cytun, of being with the people. I have smiled around this room today with friends with connections with the Scottish Parliamentary Office and my good days with Graham Blount, who was the church's liaison officer. The churches were very active during the foot-and-mouth crisis in 2001. We were involved with the withdrawal of the Children's Society from Wales. Where we need to be, and particularly in the realm of refugees and asylum seekers, we as churches have been. We do diaconate on that ecumenical level in Wales. This was an area, Aberfan, my constituency, that voted no. They voted to leave. Despite, oddly enough, being one of the regions of the UK that received the most from the EU. And we can have a long conversation about what happened and their feelings. Part of it may be that they received a lot of money, but nobody really asked them what it should be spent on. And that may be one narrative there. But we have worked on it, and my colleagues in this room have worked really hard on it. One of our small churches, the Union of Welsh Independents, shortly after the referendum vote, asked that we should come together through Cytun to respond to the situation concerning the EU. I'm delighted to say that with the work of my colleagues mainly, we've been able to have a shared response. And all our Cytun churches, Gethin was telling me earlier on, with some agencies have decided they want to be part of that process. So we've been able to speak powerfully, for example, over issues such as the rights of EU citizens in Wales. We've begun to speak very powerfully about what is the future of agriculture in Wales, particularly in the Highland territories. A very Welsh issue. Huge repercussions for us in terms of language and in terms of culture if our rurality dies, which is a very real prospect for us. So in that sense, we've been on the ball. The second picture for you, very quickly for me, is a personal one. I was in the Javits Centre in New York the night that Donald Trump was elected with the Democrats. As you can imagine, it was not a happy place. And I tried to comfort some young Americans, very much global young people, who asked us, well, how do we make sense of this? And they had a deep sense of losing their country. And some people in the UK, in Wales, Scotland, England, felt at the Brexit vote that they'd lost their country. A deep sense of grief. And I said to them in New York at the time, well, sometimes in politics the other people win. And I can never forget a young American saying, but these are not just other people. Suspecting perhaps a degree of intensity, a new paradigm that we all would have to contend with. And this is what I want to leave you with. I've studied a lot of the American response to the Trump populist phenomenon. And there's a very, very good book published just a couple of weeks ago by a professor in Yale University, Timothy Snyder. It's called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. I haven't got time to go through all 20, have I? The first two, I think, are important for us in terms of our ecumenical conversation now. The first is this. In the face of tyranny, do not give your obedience in advance. That's a good line. There have been times in the past when churches have given their obedience in advance. And it goes back to those days in Germany in particular. So do not give your obedience in advance. The second one I want to highlight here is this. Do not think that institutions now are able to defend you. It is your role to defend institutions. And I think in particular of the European Convention on Human Rights, the European rights-based values that have now been set aside. We in Wales have, this is the amazing thing about our situation. Much of the debate around Brexit focused on a mere 2.6% of the population who happen to be EU citizens from other nations. Just imagine if we gave half as much attention in terms of politics and public discourse to the 1 in 5 of us in Wales who are disabled. Who are now living in poverty and in food poverty. The final word for me, going back to the Snyder analysis, because we've dealt a lot with refugees, with asylum seekers, and been innovative in that capacity. Beware, he says, of the Reichstag movement. Our conversations around terrorism, around war, are frightening. Are truly frightening. And perhaps we as churches now have to ask the question, are we able, first of all, and I echo what Bob said right at the beginning of today, able to lay aside sometimes our arrogance, sometimes our individualism, to work together to challenge the evils of our world. Because we cannot do it separately. We cannot do it alone. When we do deal with these issues, we need to be together and to act in a new way. I asked a question earlier on, and this is what I want to ask you now. Can you imagine, and we've asked this in Wales, can you imagine now, could we ever create a Christian Aid? Would we as churches ever be able to come together to love the enemy to that extent? Or are we too fragmented and too lacking in being prophetic?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alan. Richard. Richard is the convener of the Church and Society Council of the Church of Scotland.
Thank you, Alison. Can I just follow on a wee bit from what Alan has said? It was just yesterday I was in a meeting of the Church and Society Council, of which I'm convener, and we were having a conversation around the issue of Srebrenica and the genocide that happened there just a few years ago. And one of the things that the speaker, Catherine Gilmore, who is a person who works for the Church of Scotland on issues to do with gender justice and to do with violence against women, was speaking about was this idea of the steps towards genocide and a wee triangle. And you know, at the bottom it's about rhetoric, it's about language, it's about attitudes, it's about things that people sometimes dismiss as just careless talk. But once it starts, it's on a trajectory. And so I think I would want to echo Alid's comments that some of the language, when you hear, for example, an MP on the day that Article 50 was signed, invoking the spirit of Francis Drake, both a pirate and a person who had repelled the Spanish Armada, you just wonder what on earth planet people are on and what the consequence of that kind of rhetoric can be. And there is so much of that going on. So, very much echo these kind of comments. One of the things that I feel that might be worthwhile just doing for a few moments is trying to kind of explain a little bit about why things happened differently in Scotland in terms of the Brexit vote. And that was in every region throughout Scotland. We voted by a margin of 62 to 40 to 58 to remain. And that doesn't mean to say there wasn't a significant vote and a significant number of people in Scotland who voted to leave. Alison and I know each other quite well, and one of the things that she was talking about, and I think there's something in this about the history of these two nations, England and Scotland, that's quite interesting. If you go back to the time of the Reformation, the English Reformation was, to a degree at least, characterised by a desire on the part of the authorities in England to avoid the interference of European powers. Whereas the Reformation in Scotland had a very Eurocentric character about it. We looked to places like Geneva for inspiration. So maybe there's something that carries on through history that's quite important. But I think also one of the other things, and there's a Welsh, the Deputy Speaker of the Welsh Assembly, David Melding, whom I met a couple of times in the run-up to the independence vote on Scottish independence in 2014. And he's an expert on constitutional matters, and it was a really interesting talk that he gave the first time I met him, where he went back to talk about the time of Gladstone and two attempts that were made through the Westminster Parliament to introduce a Home Rule Bill for Ireland, to introduce the concept of a federal United Kingdom, in other words. David Melding's view was that if that bill had succeeded in Parliament back in the 19th century, and we had gone down the road of a federal United Kingdom, his suggestion, I mean, whether this is true or not, is that maybe even Southern Ireland would have remained part of the United Kingdom. Who knows? The point is that in Scotland, over the last 20 years, more than that now, going back to the time of the Scottish Constitutional Convention and then leading up to the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, my guess is that there has been the beginnings of a feeling that people's voices matter, that people can actually be heard. And when you think about the run-up to the independence referendum that was held in 2014, there was an over 80% turnout at that poll, which is quite unprecedented in terms of elections in the United Kingdom over many years. So the level of engagement in political discourse has been really quite strong. And I think one of the things that I'd want to say just in very quickly and in conclusion, and it relates a wee bit to the question I asked of Heather. I think that this question of participation, both in political discourse, but participation in the whole issue of policy and how we implement policy is hugely, hugely important. A few months ago, and my quote of 2016, I went to a lecture that was given by Gus O'Donnell, who had been he was cabinet secretary to 4 different prime ministers. He's a wonderful man, a really interesting guy, lovely chap. At the end of his lecture, he said this. He said, you know, I think our problem is that our policy has been done on the basis that people are robots. Now, if that's the way in which we do policy, what do we expect? What do we expect people to do? And how do we expect people to address our political institutions? Other than to say 2 fingers, which in a sense is what the Brexit vote was all about. So one of the things I think that we're trying to do in the Church of Scotland, albeit very, very, I think we're not necessarily good at this and are not an exemplar, but it is an absolute commitment, is how can we find those voices that are often overlooked, often not heard, and have those voices as the voices that speak. And it seems to me that that's an enormously important role for the Church across Europe, is to find those mechanisms and those ways in which people who are inhabiting the margins, people with first-hand experience of poverty and inequality, people who experience vulnerabilities, such as the vulnerabilities of European citizens living in the United Kingdom, can have their voices heard, can feel themselves nurtured and respected. And it seems to me that that at the centre is the huge, important role and opportunity for the churches across Europe in whatever future we try to create for ourselves.
Thank you very much to both Alan and Richard. I mean, I think both these contributions spoke to issues and concerns which I'm sure are not restricted to Wales and Scotland, which is what makes them good. Let's have a little bit of chance for discussion. Any comments or questions which people might have for that, and then we'll pick up on Ireland and England later on. So any questions to these 2 members of the panel? Yes. Thank you, Chris.
I just hope that Kenneth could also pick up the reference to Gladstone's attempt at home rule. I too am interested in that, but it's a hypothetical question, and sometimes it's a waste of time to think of what might have been. But also to see something of the party politics and the identity politics that go into quotes, that long Irish question. It's quite salutary. It's not inspiring, but it's quite salutary. Thank you.
Can I just comment?
Yes.
Last week I attended a fascinating conversation where Carol Jones, our First Minister, had invited the Labour leader in Scotland and also Gordon Brown to come down to Cardiff to speak about federalism. And it was interesting to get the feedback to that, because the politics of Wales at the moment is that there is a growing demand for the Assembly to have more powers, but there are mutterings around some quarters around independence because there's logicality to that side. The interesting question in terms of the Constitution was, what happens with England? We have an Assembly, Scotland has a Parliament, and may go independent. What are the English issues? But the interesting question of asking the 3 of them was this, and this goes to the heart of, and I'm not being partisan here, but if you ask Welsh nationalism and if you ask Scottish nationalism, questions about identity, they will inevitably go towards, I hope, being inclusive, being modern, being diverse. And both those traditions have given very strong impetus to refugees and asylum seekers. Probably you don't know this, but Wales has the most advanced doctor retraining programme for refugees anywhere in the world. We retrained 80 doctors that are now working in the NHS. So the question we asked the panel at the time was, let's look at Wales and Scotland, and let's look at British identity, and ask difficult questions around now drivers towards flag waving, even war with Spain, being exclusive and denying rights and beginning to have passports that are more robust. And it's interesting to ask that question of them, of how unionism may be degenerating into nasty, exclusive British nationalism. And that's a tough conversation that probably the Celtic nations will now want to ask of Westminster politics. Just a thought.
Thank you. No, any other questions on that particular thing, Alison? Yes.
There's another point.
Oh, well, okay, because I mean, we will pick up on Ireland and England later on, and of course we've got Jim Wallace tomorrow, who can be asked, presumably, about federalism as well. Alison, do you want to pick up on
It's a different point.
It doesn't matter.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's just an observation that was struck by Alice's question, could we today create Christian aid, and how our church is able to work together. And we were asking that question in our group: how can we be prophetic? How can we show how can we show leadership? And it struck me that it comes down to our calling for Christian unity. And we can't lose sight of that. Yes, we need action, and we need action together as churches, but that must go hand in hand with our calling towards Christian unity, which we can't lose sight of, because it underpins the question that Alice was challenging us with, and led the discussion in our group.
Good, thank you very much. Any other questions at this stage?
I just
Yes, Richard.
respond to that, because I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think the answer is probably no, that we would not be able to create Christian aid. But in a sense, what a great objective to have. I mean, it's so interesting that these two words, koinonia and diaconia, have come together today in a lot of the conversation that we've had. And I think that perhaps one of the things that has probably tired us all out, it was Heike who said when we met in Budapest a few months ago, the ecumenical movement has almost talked about everything but achieved almost nothing. Well, I wouldn't be quite as hard and as harsh as that, but the reality is that I think a lot of what I think really works is when you do things together rather than talking about them. So I'm a great fan of the diaconia model, and I think that once we start establishing that solidarity, thinking of those resonances, thinking of those ways in which we can be that prophetic witness in social action across the European continent, that's when things start getting really exciting.
And when the urge for unity comes out, perhaps.
A quick response to that, if I may. The question for me as well is, as true ecumeniacs, what's the extent to which we are comfortable to work with the world?
With the world?
Yeah. It was interesting after the Brexit vote in Cardiff, there was a vigil arranged by some young people, just off the cuff, arranged by Twitter, by Facebook. I was asked to speak at it. 4,000 people turned up. In conversations about how to welcome refugees and asylum seekers, I now go to packed church halls because people are there. What tends to happen, I think, is that we're at that stage in church life where individual Christians are doing a lot, and pioneering Christians are doing a great deal, and being very prophetic and very brave. But perhaps institutional church hasn't caught up with that yet. And perhaps institutional church hasn't caught up with the need to work with fellow Christians, fellow faith communities, but also, crucially, people who want to do good, who have no faith.
Yeah.
Right, well, thank you very much, Alan. Could you pass it over to Kenneth, please, and we'll start on the Irish-English axis this time.
Well, if I answer Bishop Hill's question, that won't count as part of my 5 minutes. I'm going to find it hard enough anyway. 800 years. Interestingly enough, my colleague and I from Ireland, as we were coming through Edinburgh today, we were talking about Gladstone and the fact that if only there were somebody of Gladstone's stature around today, his vision, and he had his weaknesses, but there is no doubt the United Kingdom and the Republic might all be the one politically, but that might have brought us out of Europe, which we wouldn't have liked to put, but that's just what might have been. This is going to be a little bit different to what we've heard earlier, in that Ireland is, as always, of course, a special case. The Irish Council of Churches, which I'm representing here, is the Protestant and Orthodox churches on the whole island. And I think it's, broadly speaking, true to say that with Brexit, 4/5 of our members will be outside the EU. I don't think it's struck all of them yet that that's happening. Which means that we are dealing with two jurisdictions. Anyway, we're used to that, but this is going to be a new situation. And it's the Irish predicament that I'm just going to say a few words about, if I may. The electorate in the United Kingdom voted on the 23rd of June last year to leave the European Union. And I think it's true to say this was indeed a great disappointment to us. Since then, the Irish government, that's the government of the Republic, has engaged in a major diplomatic exercise throughout Europe, trying to make clear that the result of the referendum has major implications for both parts of Ireland. And in fact, the government has published a booklet on the Brexit, Ireland's priorities. So I'm not going to talk about values, I'm going to talk about our situation, which is extremely difficult. The diplomacy that the government engaged in actually has been influential in that when the Prime Minister wrote her letter to President Tusk, she actually did make reference to Irish concerns. And then when President Tusk himself responded on behalf of the Union, then he actually did use the word unique. In view of the unique circumstances on the island of Ireland, flexible and imaginative solutions will be required, including the aim of avoiding a hard border. Our concerns really are of various kinds. And I suppose the most important one is that when the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, which will happen in 3 or 4 years, the border of the Union will run across Ireland. It will run through parishes, dioceses, farms, villages. And the importance of that is that this was the situation when we had a border, a tangible border from 1920 onwards, technically 1922, a very hard border that you could only cross in certain places. And then, of course, with the Troubles, which came to a peak in the 69 and 70s, huge security. And this created an atmosphere of great tension. That has all, in fact, since 1998, with what they call sometimes the Good Friday Agreement, but is more accurately called the Belfast Agreement, the border has virtually disappeared. That doesn't mean, in fact, that, you know, the British government doesn't run as much as ever it did in Northern Ireland. But it does mean that if you, as some of you do, travel from north to south, the only difference you'll notice is that the pillar boxes change from green to red, or red to green, as the case may be. There is no discernible border at all. And this has led to tremendous relaxation and has, of course, in a sense, diffused a great deal of the tension, which led to a great deal of the violence. So our concern would be that nothing is done that would reintroduce that border. That's not going to be easy at all to achieve. There's also an economic side to it, of course, as well, in that the United Kingdom is one of our biggest customers, and where agri-food is concerned, our biggest customer. And actually, the other way around, in Northern Ireland, there is now a great deal of reciprocity where it comes to food processing and things like that between the 26 counties of the Republic and the 6 counties of the North. So there's huge economic problems there. And we also, I suppose, and my friends who work in Brussels would lament, of course, what's happening, is that we were both states that operated according to common law. And whatever people may think about Anglo-Irish relations, they're extremely close. And we work very, very closely together. And we are losing, in fact, in a sense, our closest neighbour through Brexit. So that's the sort of position we're in. I'm going to make one last point, though, if I may, that under the Lisbon Treaty, there is provision that the institutions of the Union will engage in, I think the word is transparent and regular, whatever it may be, dialogue with the civil society, including the churches. Now, it does strike me that, in fact, if ever there was something that called for that dialogue to take place urgently, it should take place over Brexit and its implications for us all. And dare I suggest that the Irish churches, as an all-Ireland body, who are particularly involved in the situation that Brexit has created, would have an input into such dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now over to Jerry Worthen, who has valiantly arrived in time for this slot, having just rushed up from the station just a short time ago. But I hope you've got your breath back now. Jeremy is the Secretary for Ecumenical Relations and Theology at the Council for Christian Unity in the Church of England.
Thank you. And first of all, my apologies for not being here with you earlier and for not being here for the first couple of sessions, and therefore do forgive me, please, if anything I say repeats what you've previously heard or shows my ignorance of that. I feel some trepidation, really, kind of representing English Christianity or English churches. I'm from the Church of England, that's the church I know best, and everything about colours what I say. And English Christianity is, of course, very, very diverse. Over 40 members of churches together in England, and grown very, very rapidly over the last 10 years. The situation of Christianity in England continues to diversify quite rapidly. So trying to kind of speak on behalf of the churches is not at all a straightforward thing, and sometimes I'm not going to try and do it, but I will try and just put that caveat in on the word go. I'd just like to share 4 questions from where I sit. By my desk most of the time in Church House, dare I say Church House, Westminster. Westminster has been invoked as a core part of the problem, but there you go, that's where I work most days of the week. 4 questions. Why the gap? Where was the leadership? Are we in ecumenical trauma? And where will fresh thinking come from? So the first question, why the gap? The only polling, as I understand, that's been done about votes on independence in relation to religious affiliation showed that across the United Kingdom, 56% of Christians voted to leave. That means a significantly higher proportion of Christians voted to leave than of the population at large. You wouldn't guess it from talking to church leaders in most of our mainstream denominations. Forgive me, you wouldn't perhaps guess it from the conversation so far here. In terms of the United Kingdom, we may reasonably presume that the proportion of Christians who voted leave in England was significantly higher than 56%. That would seem to be an entirely reasonable assumption. So that's the context in which churches operate, and I think we've seen something in the Church of England and other denominations of trying to kind of get to grips with that and what that means. Why does that gap exist between the leadership of our churches and the views of members? What's the reason for it? Where has it come from? First question, why the gap? Second question, where was the leadership? That's been a complaint that has been levelled at the Church of England in particular, against some of the bishops of the Church of England. Where was the leadership running up to the referendum vote? Why wasn't a stronger case made? But I think one can actually push the question further back and say, why was it so difficult to make a convincing case for the European Union in relation to, English politics generally, in relation to the churches in particular? Why do we not seem to have a convincing case to make? And the issue about where was the leadership, I think, runs much further back than the last year or so. Where's the leadership been in terms of having a strong and proper vision of what that's about, and one robust enough to withstand the changes that we've seen? My third question, are we in ecumenical trauma? There clearly is a historic relationship between the project of ecumenism, we can call it a project, a movement of ecumenism, and a project of political integration. in Europe and moves more widely. You know, the Lambeth Appeal to All Christian People, that is dear to my heart as an Anglican ecumenist from 1920, you know, came very close to the formulation of the League of Nations. You know, these things don't exist in discrete compartments. The British the decision of the UK to leave the European Union, on the face of it, is a kind of a body blow to the idea that Europe is moving towards ever closer integration for the first time anyone has left the European Union. How do we come to terms with the sort of the shockwaves across to our own commitment to the cause of Christian unity? Does this mean that basically the world is losing faith in attempts to bring about sort of greater forms of institutional, cultural unity? Does this mean that in fact the tide is turning away from ecumenism and away from the kind of endeavour that many of us have given so many years of our life to? Many people who are passionate about ecumenism do seem to be in a degree of trauma following the Brexit vote. How are we going to recover from that and come back to a more kind of to come back to a really constructive response? My fourth question: where will the fresh thinking come from? It does seem to me that we need fresh thinking. We can't, you know, we may want to lament that the thinking of the past doesn't seem to have survived, it doesn't seem to be valued, but we're going to need some fresh thinking. My colleague from Church House, Charles Reid, tells me about the white paper published by the European Commission on the future of Europe, which looks at 5 options about the future of Europe. We need to have some kind of creative thinking about different ways forward, and we need to find ways in which the churches can contribute together to that conversation, and ways in which, to go back to what I was saying earlier, we can once again find resources out of our relationship as churches to inform and support the conversation about the proper kind of relationship between societies and nations as we go into the 21st century. I think that's my point.
That's very good. Thank you very much, Jeremy and Kenneth, for these inputs. Any questions to Kenneth and Jeremy first of all? Yes.
Just following on to what you said, Jeremy, do you think the ecumenical trauma has any particular implications for structural ecumenism within the 4 nations and across the 4 nations?
I don't think it has any direct kind of immediate consequences, but it might be a case to kind of look at. You're talking about the Christian aid and all that. You know, what kind of structures do we need? You know, we're asking questions about the appropriate structures for our relationship with the European Union, the United Kingdom, and as 4 nations and all the rest of it. But are there parallel questions about our own structures and the kind of structures that we need going forward? Do we need to do some fresh thinking about the cause of Christian unity and what it's going to look like in the coming decades?
Mm-hmm. Very interesting question. Yes.
Yeah, it's partially in connection with the Church of England, because I've been as a priest with the Episcopal Church doing a locum in the Netherlands over the past few months. And there is a massive degree of worry and anxiety on the part of people who are members of the Anglican congregation there, who are British citizens and have never taken out Dutch citizenship. And they've stayed on after the death of the spouse. They would see themselves as living there. And now major uncertainty about the future. Also problems about people who are students married to EU citizens aren't earning the amount of cash that they officially need. And again saying, are our families going to be split, you know, and how far can families live together? And I just wondered how far this was a particular issue that the churches could make almost a red line demand in terms of negotiation about sort of Brexit.
Fighting with the mic here.
I don't think that it's a good question. I can't answer it straightforwardly. I mean, I can just say that perhaps it's helpful to underline the point that the Church of England paradoxically includes the diocese in Europe.
Yes.
which is why these sort of things can go about. So we're definitely not leaving Europe as the Church of England. But that particular relationship means that we are very aware of the concerns of members of our congregations across Europe on precisely the point you raised, and kind of inversely, our relationships with the Porvo Communion, with Lutheran churches from Scandinavia, Baltics in particular. And I was talking to one of the pastors of the Porvo churches in London, who's got very, very parallel acute concerns about their own congregation members here in this country. So I think we're well placed to hear those concerns. What we do with them and where we take them is a very important question, and maybe one to which we want to give some time.
Just quickly, back home I have the ignominy of being the chair of the Wales Migration Partnership, which is Home Office sponsored. And I reflect on the fact that we are now living in these islands in what I would call the age of othering. It's the age of othering, where it is there across the board that the different is less welcome than he or she used to be. We have now designed policies in terms of asylum that give preferential treatment to some, to be a little bit more unwelcoming of those who arrive by the dispersal system. Across the board, we were in a meeting of CCMN with CTPI last week, and the black-led churches were saying that it's now very, very difficult for them. The immigration policies are being implemented far more harshly than they used to be. And across the board, this is a problem. This is why in Wales we highlighted the need to protect the EU citizens that we have in our midst, and we will do so publicly. I think this is one of those red lines where we have to perpetually challenge the politics of our age. And to say that we believe that we are all human, and that humanity does not belong to any given nation, but that we will stand for the stranger in our midst. And if we fail to do that as a Christian community, then I think we will have lost our soul.
Any other questions on that? Charles?
Yeah, just really a question to ask how much you think the vote to come out of the EU should actually affect our relations with a body like, say, the Conference of European Churches. Do we need to reimagine our own membership of such a pan-European body to see ourselves more as a kind of Norwegian church model, and even Protestant churches in countries like Switzerland, rather than the existing relationship which we've had? Be interested to get the views of
Jeremy, it was your idea.
Well, while I'm also thinking, just a quick answer for that one. We will be meeting as General Secretaries in Cardiff soon, Heike, and I have been working on it. And I think this will be one of the major considerants for us as colleagues, is to say that although the UK has decided to leave the EU, we are passionately European, and that we are committed to the European church dynamic. We may have to redefine it, but I think it's crucial now that we recommit ourselves and re-energize ourselves into that process. And I may go back to one thing that I said earlier from my point of view. It's time for us not to expect these institutions to defend us, but we have to defend them. It has never been more important for us to uphold the institutions of these islands, but also our European agencies. It's vital that we do it.
Any other questions?
Oh, do you want
to
reply very quickly? I think it's a really good question, and it's because I'm aware of that as a question. It's one of the reasons I wanted to be here at this conference and to have a chance to talk across at many different levels of people from KEC and from the Four Nations about these questions. And I'm really grateful to ACTS for organising it for the benefit of all of us. I do think there's a real kind of question about that. You know, the open letter that I know you had a session on before I came, it talks about the centrality of the European Union to the kind of European project. Well, if the European Union is kind of central in that sense, and we're not part, and to how KEC is dealing with these issues, and we're not part of the European Union, then that would suggest that we must become more peripheral in terms of KEC. There's a sort of remorseless logic about that. At the same time, of course, part of what's so wonderful about KEC is it involves churches from across Europe, from way beyond the European Union. And it seems to me to have tremendous value in terms of holding a vision of Europe
that's actually much bigger than the European Union, and includes the Orthodox churches and the Central and Eastern Europe and all the rest of it. So I think there is a really important question there. And I think it's partly a question back to KEP, which I'm sure we wanted to talk about the relationship between that wider membership of KEP and the clear importance of the European Union in terms of European politics.
This question of the parallel between the political structures and the ecumenical enterprise is fascinating, and I think it's really important. But I think maybe it's often said that Brexit happened because there was this gap between the political world and the individual. But the churches fill that gap. And the churches aren't just about politics. We're not just politicians. We have that associational potential right across Europe. And I think that's one of the things which maybe as churches we should emphasise more at this particular point. I'm allowed to make a comment from the chair. Any other comments? Yeah.
Corey Thompson from the Scottish Churches Parliamentary Office. And I was just thinking that the conversation we've had just now is very much focused on the church. And I think that for many of us, the church is also part of wider civil society. So I was wondering when you see the voice of the church in that wider public debate, rather than in this more internal conversation that we've been having.
Would you like to do that one? Richard?
I think that's a really important point, and I suppose it relates to my question about institutional ecumenism and whether it is in crisis, whether there is an issue there that really it's, to a degree, it's kind of run its course, and it's achieved a lot in many respects. But I think that one of the things that has come up in the conversation that we've had earlier is this question about power. The European Union, to some extent, has been criticised by a lot of people, whichever way they voted, because it's become a power structure. And it was really interesting, someone made the point earlier, I think it was Heather, that in the discourse both for and against our membership of the European Union, very few people talked about the issue of what the European Union had achieved in terms of social justice, what is achieved instead in terms of peacemaking. You know, the European continent has witnessed a war on average every 10 years for the last 1,000 years. And for a period of time of 40 or 50 years, since the Second World War, apart from obviously in the former Yugoslavia, we've witnessed a period of peace, a period of cultural coming together. So I think that one of the issues that is really important for us to focus on is the issue not of power. And I think that's been the stumbling block, because the ecumenical discourse has always stumbled at the point where people have to give up power. But of course, you know, when we think about Jesus, we think about someone who did not take the same kind of power, the institutional power that the churches claim for themselves. And if we want to be a more Christ-like presence, then I think we have to dethrone this concept of power. And that's, for me, why it becomes so valuable to talk about this diaconal ministry, this ministry that is about reconciliation, about peacemaking, about building bridges, about not claiming power for ourselves, but actually losing it for the sake of the world.
Can I make a quick comment on that one? Wales has no established church. And when devolution came into being, we were very concerned that the new political institution would replace the clout of the churches. I remember how I used to come to Scotland and listen to the big debates in the Church Synod and how that mattered. I can remember the Bishop of California coming to see us during one Lambeth conference when we discussed this issue of power, and we explained how vulnerable and how servant-like it to be. And he came out with this wonderful line. He said, "It's probably your vulnerability that has made you strong." It was an interesting reflection for us, because we've had to work hard in terms of public engagement at actually delivering not as somebody who has power and clout, but as somebody who serves. Only today, the whole strategy around asylum seekers was based upon a quote that we'd given them in the National Assembly. They've devised a whole strategy around it because we said it, but not because we were powerful or strong, but because we take a lead in that world. And I think that goes to the servant role rather than the privileged power role. And it's a new model for us that's working quite well, but boy, is it difficult.
Thank you, Ahmed. Bob?
I'm interested in this idea about ecumenical institutional humanism. And we asked earlier on whether we could create another Christian Aid just now. There's a much more recent example or question that I would put. Could we today foresee an ecumenical response that's called Time for Action, where together the Church has created a resource around childlessness? And the answer in my mind is clearly no. Because wherever the ecumenical movement moves towards something that's prophetic, it gets shut down. And I remember the guy who ran the racial justice work for CTUI for a number of years, Arlington Trotman, saying, if we're not asking the questions here, meaning in the ecumenical space, where will they be asked? Because they're not going to be asked in the churches. Because the churches, when they get to the difficult issues, shut them down. And in fact, the reality is over the last 10 years, that when the ecumenical structures around the four nations have come close to anything that looks like prophetic, except where they've been able to break through with the help of a number of individuals, they've been closed down by money. And that's where the power is. Follow the money, and you find out who has a voice in the church.
Does anyone want to cheer us up after that one?
Let's be able to choose it.
To be a little more positive, in terms of ecumenical development, I point to ecumenical developments around particular problems or projects. And I give you an example of across Europe, environmental movements in churches have grown rapidly. So we have in Hungary, ECUMENICAL. In Germany, we have Eco Church. In England and Wales, we have Eco Congregation in Scotland. Eco Congregation in Scotland started in 2001. Some point this year, there will be 400 churches, which is 10% of all the churches of all denominations in Scotland. So the nature of ecumenical working is changing, and the structures may have to reflect that, but certainly around problems or the work currently done on refugees in Scotland. There are very good examples of strong ecumenical developments taking place, which we should be quite proud of.
Thank you. Yes, Katrina.
Just to add to that, because I think that the ecumenical movement on the question of migrants has done a lot, and I'm thinking, for example, there are many examples, but I'm only thinking of Greece last summer. The German churches were the first who picked up the phone and asked us who are the people on the islands that we can be in touch with, and how do you want us exactly to contribute, not just financially. They sent people to train the local churches to respond to all these waves of migrants that came in. But of course, these are stories that aren't heard. And for me, a question is, when we lose all this optimism about the ecumenical vision, how do we make these stories known? And there were also cases where they were asking how they can be more effective politically, how they could put pressure on their government, for instance, to help more, accept more migrants. So it's easy to forget or to not to acknowledge these positive things that are going on, but we should be reminding ourselves of them.
Thank you. I think we're about to come to an end on this one, but Paul, yes.
There are, I think, 3 examples that we should be thinking of which give cause for optimism. 2 of them have already been mentioned, in the Eco congregations and in the work on refugees. To some extent, those are both institution-led, institution-driven. It's not quite there, but they're coming downwards and being defined. But I think we should also pay attention to the work which is done in the food banks, which is coming from many individual Christians rather than from the institutional church. And to me, one of the biggest signs of optimism is that there is activity between the churches at the individual level. That, I think, is a major source of encouragement, and we shouldn't be losing sight of it.
Thank you very much. None of that is to deny the examples that Rob was talking about, but still maybe got a bigger perspective on the question there.